everybody, my name's Jo and I'm an independent Stampin' Up demonstrator from the UK. I'm going to show you how I've made this card today. It's proved quite popular and I've promised to come on and do a quick tutorial for you. So this is the card when it's folded flat, so this will go into your envelope like normal, and then it's going to pop up and pop up at the front as well, so that you get this lovely sort of double easel card. But the front one is like a reverse easel. It's a bit hard to explain without showing you, but it's really actually really simple to make. It's just obviously sort of having all the bits and pieces together really. So I'm going to show you how I've made it, and then you can obviously change things as you wish and do what you want to do with it really. So it's incorporating the two stamp sets. So we have Perched in a Tree, which is the beautiful robin, or the well-fed robin as I call him, because he's got a nice big belly. And then we're going to use this little dotty stamp on the background. And then I did use this greeting on the original one, but I'm actually going to use the Thinking of You on this one. And we're using obviously these beautiful leaves here as well from the Soft Seedlings stamp set. So the first thing you're going to do or need is a piece of crumb cake cardstock, and this is going to be your card base. So this is a standard card base. So I work in metric, but I'm going to give you the imperial measurements too, because you can make it either way. So our card base is 29.75 centimetres long by 10.5 wide, and we scored at 14.85, and that will give us our landscape card base, but we're actually going to be using it in portrait format. And if you're imperial, you're going to be 11 inches long by 4.25 wide, and you're going to score at 5.5. So your cards in metric will metric and imperial cards will be slightly different shape, but the actual process is exactly the same. You're then going to need another piece of cardstock, and this one is measuring the exact size of your card. So this one is 14.85 by 10.5 centimetres, and you're going to be, if you're working in imperial, beg your pardon, you're going to be 5.5 inches by 4.25 inches. And I'm going to use this die here, which is this beautiful birch trees from the Aspen Trees dies. So I'm going to pop my card base to one side, and the first thing I want to do is to cut my actual big die from the centre of this. Okay, so I'm going to bring in my cutter. So I just want to sort of line it up pretty central, top, bottom and sides. As I say, if you're working in imperial, your edges will be slightly different to ours. Okay, so I'm just going to pop out all those bits from there and get rid of these bits off of my plate. Going to move that out of the way just for a moment. So the next thing I did was to stamp the actual background, and as I say, I've used the little dotty stamp from the Perched in a Tree stamp set, and I'm using soft suede, but I've actually stamped it off because the original stamp is quite dark. So I'm stamping off, stamping on, and I've literally just gone around the outside edge with this. Don't worry if you go over the trees a little bit, it doesn't matter. It's just to give it a little bit of interest really, because it's quite plain otherwise, so it was just to add just that little bit of interest. Okay, so that's that done. So the next thing we want to do is to take our card base. Now we want to score the front of our card at halfway. So working in metric, I'm going to score mine at 7.4. I'm not worried about 0.5 millimetre. So 7.4. Now, if you're working in Imperial, you're going to be scoring yours at 2 3/4 inches. Okay, now what I want to do is just to line up the front. Got a little piece there, that's it. So I'm going to line up the front on the front of my easel. So this is just a basic easel card. Okay, and now I'm just going to flip it over lightly and just mark with a pencil, just so I can see where I need to glue to. So I'm going to add glue on my trees up to that actual pencil line. So I need to make sure that I've got plenty of glue on the bottom and where it joins here at the top. Also a little bit on the middle bits, but they're not so important. It's the top and bottom where you want to make sure there's plenty of glue. Okay, and I'm going to line this up onto the front of my card. Make sure it's all nice and straight. And make sure those trees are nice and stuck down. So now you can see I have got these sections in the middle. So if you look at my original one, I've actually removed those sections. So I'm quickly going to show you how to do that. So I need to bring in my cutting machine again. So when we had the old plates, which didn't have this lovely beveled edge on them, what we were able to do was to actually put our card into our machines, and we could actually line up the edge of our plates on the score line, so that when it cut through, it would only cut through this section, it wouldn't cut the top. Now that we have these lovely beveled edges, which are fabulous because that makes them go through the machine so much easier, unfortunately what it does for this actual technique is it tends to push the actual plate backwards, so you end up only cutting a tiny little section of your die. So to get round that, what I've done, I'm going to start on this side here. I'm going to place over my top plate, just like I would normally cut. I've made sure my die is sort of slotted back into where it was originally. And I'm going to roll this through until the halfway mark. So just be a little bit conscious of where your halfway may be. You might find that you need to go a little bit beyond halfway and then just roll it backwards. So this may not have gone all the way through, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little knife to it in a second. So if I open that carefully, can you see I've now just cut up roughly to that score line. It's not quite on it, but that's fine. What I do want to do very quickly is just to fold that back on itself, make sure that is nice and tight sort of score. Okay, so now what I want to do is bring in my little cutting mat, and I'm going to very carefully just cut along my score line between each of the actual trunks of the trees. I'm not worried about these top bits because these are the actual back of the card when it's complete. So just carefully, if you want to use a ruler for this part, you can. And I'm going to try and pop these out. Now some will come out. I suspect some I might just need to finish the little cut because it's not quite halfway. Oh, come out. So can you see just down those two edges, that's all it's going to take, and then they will just pop out nicely for me. So again, just from that score line, so you're better off going a little bit, tiny bit short, and then you can actually hopefully pop them out a lot easier. So you're not actually using your knife to actually make fresh cuts. You're just following the actual line of where the die cut through. I'm just going along that edge, and again, pop it out and pop the end one out there. So there we go. So that is our basic easel card. So that will stand up like that. It will flop about for a little while until, one, we get some weight on it, but also we'll re-burnish all the score lines and make sure that it sits nice and flat in a moment. Okay, so that's our original easel card. So really nice and simple. So the next thing we want to do is to make the front easel part. Now for this, you're going to need another piece of crumb cake cardstock. So in metric, we are going to cut ours at 13 centimetres by 10.5. So it's already 10.5 across, and we're going to cut it at 13 centimetres. And I'm going to score this at 1 centimetre. I'm going to pop it back in my trim of the other side, and then at 7 centimetres. So effectively I've got a 1 centimetre sort of joining piece here, and then these two sections should be the same size. So now if you're working in imperial, you are going to cut yours to 4¼ inches square. So it's a nice simple measurement, and you're going to score at 1/4 inch and then at 2¼ inches. Okay, sorry, beg your pardon, 1/4 inch and then 2 inches. Let me just correct that. Okay, so you'll have 4¼ inches, 1/4 inch, and then 2 lots of 2 inches. So yours will be slightly smaller, but the reason I've done it slightly smaller is because your card is also slightly smaller. So we wanted to keep the proportions sort of correct. Okay, so I'm just going to burnish these score lines as well. Just make sure they're nicely burnished. And I'm going to attach this to my card. So I'm just going to glue along this small little join here. And I want to glue this onto the front of my card. But I want it glued on the inside. Okay, so I've turned my card over and I'm just gluing that so it will now appear on the inside. So that is effectively your double easel, and this is your reverse section here. So now what I've done is I've cut a piece of a very vanilla cardstock, and this is measuring exactly the same, 14.85 by 10.5. But what I do want to do is just to trim a very small little piece off the end, because I want to make sure that when this folds, this isn't going to get stuck. Can you see what's happening? That's trying to sort of push that up. So I find it easier just to trim a bit longer, and then we're just going to trim a tiny bit off the end and make sure that it fits in between those score lines, and there's going to be no puckering once it's in. So that's fine. So by doing this, I'm covering this join. So because I didn't want to see that join on the back, I wanted it hidden inside. Okay, so, and this is very vanilla. And again, if you're working in imperial, yours are going to be 5.5 inches by 4¼ so it's just the full size of your card, and then you're just going to trim that tiny bit off the end to make sure that this will still fold flat. And we're going to need to trim this section in a second as well, so just so you're aware, that is catching a little bit at the moment. Okay, so the next section we have is the front here, and this is underneath our little robin. So this section here, and this measures, it's very vanilla again, and if you're in metric, you're 10 and a half centimetres by 5.5 centimetres, and if you're working in imperial, you're going to measure 4.25 inches by 1.75 high. And again, I just took this lovely little dotty stamp and again stamped off just some random dots. I overlapped them a little bit. A lot of it's going to be hidden anyway, so don't worry too much, but it was just to add just that, again, that little bit of interest on the back of where the leaves are going to be. And you can actually glue that into place if you wish. So what I've left is a tiny border, top and bottom, again, just to break it up. I didn't want it to be the full, very vanilla across there. Okay, so that is, in theory, your card made together. So if that's what you wanted to learn, then obviously that's done. I'm going to carry on and just show you how I did the leaves and also do a little bit of colouring on the bird. So that's our card. Now you can see, because that's got a bit of extra weight on it now, that is sitting there quite comfortably, and these two actually support each other, so they actually put pressure on each other to stay in place. So you don't need that extra little bar in the middle that I showed you at the beginning. Okay, but what you do need is this card is going to overlap this. So can you see that's puckering that up just a little bit? So what I want to do is trim a tiny bit off the front of this card. So I'm going through double layer, remember, so just be aware of that. And I've just taken off a little slither. Hopefully it's enough. See a little slither here. I want to make sure that that is just short, and then this is going to fold over the top of that, and that will have our bird and everything else on it. Okay, nice and simple. Okay, so let's talk about the leaves. So for the leaves, I have simply stamped them and added colour while still on the stamp. That's actually thick, very vanilla, I think. That's better, that's thin. Okay, so I'm using thin, very vanilla. It doesn't really matter, but they're easier to cut out if they're with the thinner variety. So I'm starting off with crushed curry. Can't get my words out today. So crushed curry ink all over my sauce seedlings stamp. I'm then going to work in colour order, because I'm going to be adding ink, so I want to make sure that I'm not contaminating any of these ink pads. So I'm starting off with pumpkin pie, and I've just taken a blender brush, picking up a little bit of ink, and I'm literally just dabbing. Okay, I'm then going to take Merry Merlot, another brush for that. Now obviously this is quite a lot darker, so just be a little bit careful of how much of that you're adding. And then darker still, we have Mossy Meadow. Now this is really quite dark, so just be a little bit careful. Now can you see I've got this harsh line? So if you just then go back in and tap with your brush, then you'll remove any of those harsh sort of lines. And I'm just going to go back in with another little bit of Merry Merlot, just add a little bit more red to that. Okay, so you can see I've added all those colours onto there, and I'm just going to stamp them on. So look how beautiful that all comes out. You could use the baby wipe technique if you wanted to. So with the re-inkers, you could use that if you wanted to, of course. This is a lot quicker and a lot less mess. So I quite like this sort of technique. all you need to make sure is that you clean your stamp in between each one, because if you don't, then you're going to contaminate your ink pad. So just be aware of that. So clean my stamp, and I'm going back in with crushed curry. I'm going to take a little bit of pumpkin pie. A little bit of Merry Merlot. I quite like the Merry Merlot coming through. A little bit of Mossy Meadow. As I say, this one comes on really dark, so just be careful. I'm going to go back with a little bit more of the Merry Merlot like I did before. Okay, and then I'm going to stamp straight on to my Very Vanilla. Okay, so nice and simple. Now I fussy cut these leaves because sadly we don't have a die for this beautiful leaf, but it's not as bad as it looks, so persevere. They do come out really beautiful. I think they're really lovely stamps, so really nice. Oh, quick drink. Okay, so that's your leaves. So nice and simple. Cut those out. I'm not going to sit and cut them out here because I think it's quite self-explanatory from the card exactly how I've cut them and then glued them onto my piece here so they're overlapping. I also did a couple of the little spinny things in exactly the same way, so they all need just to be cut out. Okay, so that's our leaves. So the next thing I want to do is to colour my robin. Now I am going to show you roughly how I coloured him because I do get asked an awful lot about my colouring techniques and different products that I use. So this time I've just used our watercolour pencils, but I'm using them dry. I'm not using them with any water for this. I find that it gives a nice soft technique. You can use water if you're proficient in watercolouring. I'm not a watercolorer. I love playing, but I'm not, I'm not a professional by any means. Sorry, I've got a stupid tickle in my throat there. I keep feeling I'm going to cough. So what I've done is I've stamped the actual birding stays on. I've chosen stays on because if I did want to add water, I can do. And I find it's just a little bit more stable than the Memento when you're using the pencils. You can use Memento, it's not a problem, but sometimes you can pick up the ink a little bit. It's just a little bit more stable with stays on. And I've decided to do him on white because I wanted that whiteness of his belly to show through. So that's why I've stamped on white rather than Very Vanilla. And I've used just 4 colours for this. So I have Early Espresso, I have Cajun Craze, Pumpkin Pie, and a little bit of Real Red. Now, where sometimes we go wrong with our little robins is they're known as robin redbreast, but actually their breasts aren't red. They're actually more orange than they are red. So I try and use a little bit of red just to bring in those red tones, but not too much. So I'm going to start off with the actual Early Espresso section. So when I'm colouring with pencils, I tend to use a flicking technique. So when we're actually, when we're learning to colour at school and things like that, we tend to do this. And there is a time and place for that. But if I'm trying to add detail, then I will always use this flicking technique, and you can use it in the direction of the actual feathers, or if you're flowers, you might go from the centre of the flower outwards. It just depends on what you're doing. And I'm taking each section individually. So these sort of feathers here are kind of all the same. So I'm going in one direction with those. And then I'm going to use the top part of his head and body here. And this wing, so this wing from here, again, in the direction that the feathers would go. And you can build up your colour just by layering it over the top. So just keep flicking over the top and you'll find that those colours will all start to blend lovely. These pencils actually blend really beautifully. So I'm putting my first layer down. Okay, we're going to build these up in a second, but you'll see this is quite a quick technique. And again, just try and think about which way the feathers might go away from his little red breast. So I'm just turn my page around and just follow that through. Okay, now it's quite brown. So what I wanted to do is add a little bit of orangey tones into it. So I'm using a little bit of Cajun Craze and I'm coming over the top of those feathers. And I'm not going right to the end necessarily this time. So I'm just going over the top. And you can see how it's changing the tone of those feathers. We're going a little bit more orangey, which we're going to knock back again in a moment. It's just breaking down those tones a little bit, just to early espresso is quite dark really for this. So now I've added a bit of Cajun Craze, I'm coming back with my early espresso, and this time I'm pressing a little bit harder because before I've left it quite sort of soft and I've not put too much pressure on my pencils. This time I'm not putting a lot of pressure, just a little bit more. And can you see how these tones again are changing? So this is over the top of the Cajun Craze where I've just been. And I particularly want to put a little bit darker where the shapes of the feathers are. So this is our little wing. There's going to be a little shadow under here. So I'm just adding a little bit dark under there. And you can always go back and add a little bit more. So if I want a little bit more orangey tones, I can come back with my Cajun Craze and they will all blend really, really softly and well together. Just avoid pressing too hard too quickly because you want to get that layer of colour down first. Again, add a few more orangey tones to that. Oh, I've got an annoying fly flying around. I wonder if you could hear that. Okay, and you just keep going basically until you've got the tone you like, the colour you like. You know, it's entirely up to you how much you put down. If you prefer using stamping blends, you could use blends. If you prefer watercolours, then you can obviously use water. I just like the dry pencil technique because it's quick, it's simple, plus also it's great if you're travelling. So if you're going on holiday, got a long journey, you want a little bit of colouring to take with you or whatever, then you can do that. And you don't need many materials, so it's quite good for that. Okay, I'm going to come back to that in a second. I'm going to just quickly do his beak. So his beak is still a sort of browny colour. And then I'm going to move on to his red breast. So I'm mainly going to be using pumpkin pie, and I'm going to be doing the same thing. So flicking techniques in the direction that his feathers would go. And so I'm not putting a great deal of pressure on here. I'm just literally just laying some colour. Now I'm starting from the bottom and flicking up, but that's still the direction of his feathers, if that makes sense. I'm not going sideways, so just think about where his feathers would go. I'm just building up that colour. I'm going to move around to the other side of his face. So even when I'm filling in these little bits, I'm still using my strokes in one direction. I think it just gives a nicer finish. We are going to blend them in a second, so you'll be able to use the traditional techniques, but so again, I'm just going over with another layer just to deepen that colour slightly. Try and keep your pencils reasonably sharp as well. You don't want them too sharp because then you tend to get more sort of stroke marks. So you don't want them too sharp, but if they're really blunt, then you'll struggle to get the sort of colour down. Okay, so I've added some orange for his red breast. Now I'm going to bring in a little bit of real red. So this is just adding some red tones to his belly, to his breast. Now notice I'm not going all the way down. I just want to go probably a half to 2/3 of the way down. And again, just from his beak, I'm just adding those red tones. Okay, then I'm going to come back in with my pumpkin pie again. And this is where the colours were all blend together, but again I'm just using that simple one direction stroke. Okay, so I think I'm quite happy with his breast. Now, if you want to blend them slightly, what you can do is then bring in the old technique, but very, very lightly. Don't put hardly any pressure down. You're just blending those colours together in the traditional sort of backwards and forwards colouring motion. Okay, and then I just wanted to add a little bit of colour onto his actual underbelly, because he's not completely white under there. He does have some sort of browning feathers. So again, I'm just adding, and on these little hash lines you can add a little bit of brown as well, because there's sort of the feathers, just adds a little bit of depth. See, very lightly I'm pressing on here. And again, I'm going to go in with a few little flicks of Cajun Craze. Just adds those dimension really. And again, at this point you can use a little bit of the traditional colouring, but very, very lightly. I'm hardly putting any pressure on that whatsoever. And then for his little feet, I'm just using my Early Espresso in full colour, just to make them a little bit darker. So there we go. That's how I coloured Robin. So it doesn't actually take that long. It's quite, it's quite a quick process, but it's just that, nice sort of feeling really of spending some time colouring and get lost in it. So as I say, I'm not going to spend any more time sort of showing you how it went together from this point on, because I think it's quite self-explanatory. You may have to fiddle around with this a little bit just to make sure you get the pressure correct, but you'll find once you've got all your elements stuck on, then it kind of holds it together anyway. So I will finish this off camera, and whatever I've done with my leaves, here we go. So there's my leaves, there's my Robin, and he will be popped on top with a little thinking of you. I need to do a couple of my little things. And then I just finished it off with just 2 or 3 little gems, just so that you could have a little bit of sparkle, because we all love a bit of sparkle, don't we? So I hope that explains how it was made. If you've got any questions, or if any of the measurements aren't 100% clear, then please just drop me a message and I can run through those with you. But it's actually a reasonably simple card to make, to be honest. It's just knowing where to sort of start with it. So I hope you'll have a go and enjoy. Take care. Bye.